That was back. Am I back? I think I'm back. Yeah, I think I'm back. I'm presuming I'm back. Let me know in chat. That was crazy. Something. I should also mention that I still have Unity loaded, and it's probably eating up all my RAM in the background. So that's probably exit play mode on in Unity just to make sure that we're not using 40 gigs of RAM in the background extra. But yeah, so go away Unity. Ooh. Something happened that caused my encoder in OBS to just freak out completely and broke the stream temporarily. That was exciting. On the topic of automatic price comparisons, possibly you could set an average between certain items. For instance, if I set it iron bar and bar is worth currency exchange for 1.5. Yeah, I think I like this. This is pretty neat. Using the ramps as a way to have stairs outside. I like it. I like seeing all of these new fancy kind of ways people are coming around it. So one thing that I'm not impressed by from a building and integrity perspective, I would dare say that this should probably collapse somehow, some way. While it's great for storing large volumes of goods, yeah, it's not the finest addition to the scene in the world when you're passing one of those. Structural integrity has been a topic for a while. Now, I do appreciate multi-layered farms like this one, but I wanted to add more kind of requirements. So these types of farms will be able to exist in the future, but most likely we'll be adding some type of restriction to them, such as lighting and so on. So you'd need electrical lights to be able to pull these off. So these wooden scalable farms like this wouldn't be something that you could do early on, with the exception of things like mushrooms, for instance, where you have like a layer of wheat and then a layer of mushrooms below or something. But that is kind of way off the scope of 10.0, so that'll be in the future. But it is something that we are looking at. But things like hydroponics and scientific growth columns and is something that do exist and something that we don't want to completely remove without adding some sort of functionality that you could potentially look at getting them to work. Sure that the guy that don't see the gravity of the situation. No, he probably sees the very opposite coin. Some docks and harbor building here. So on the subject of building restrictions and building requirements, what do you guys think of the medium shipyard, where it has a requirement of water blocks being adjacent? It was pretty controversial, I think, in terms of when we were looking at where we want to go with water restriction, water requirements and water restrictions. And one of the things that kept popping up during our boat development was the fact that we kind of wanted to force people to be building these dockyards at a water source of some type, be it, a river or a lake or so on and so forth. But we did want it to have that visual impact of kind of stick to the water. Editor, only the larger shipyards should be restricted. Yeah, and that's also what I had in mind when we added the small one. So the small one doesn't have a water restriction, because in my head that looked like something that, this could be in your garage or something, where you could be building in a you can be building on these smaller boats in a workshop and so on and so forth. But that felt like it was all right to not have any type of water placement restrictions, versus something where the larger boats would come off these bigger shipyards, and it made sense to kind of force that onto water. Now, onto the same type of placement restrictions, because now we do have kind of the water adjacency requirement as a mechanic and functionality that we can apply to anything. Of course, I've been looking at, what can we do more with this thing, and what can we do to kind of incorporate that into other objects, what would make sense. And some of the objects that are likely potentially subjected to it in the future are going to be things like the rocker box, where it's using river water to be able to process, and having those placed in the middle of the desert with no water, that makes no sense, because they are a water process. But that's not going to be something that we're adding in 10, but it is definitely something that we are looking more into. And as we're kind of revolving around the water subject, we are looking at more ways to improve it, as I mentioned, in terms of both the UX and the quality of life. How can you move it? How can you shift it around and work with it? Looking at how it's also working against the player in terms of flooding and so on and so forth. But also from a pollution aspect. Right now, the water, even if it gets polluted, it's kind of only a visual representation of what is going on in the world. And something that I want to do, at least, is have water properly be pollution. Where wet tailings, for instance, is a general placeholder block. So wet tailings will eventually, it has always been gold to not be, a solid block that you place out. It'll actually be a liquid, and it can disperse and spread and kind of mix in with water as is. And properly kind of permanently pollute water, if you will. So going down that road, we're looking at things like you need a waste filter to kind of keep pollution out of water when you're doing things that may add polluted water or sewage as an output. But at the end, if you polluted your ocean too much, you'll have stuff dying in the water. You'll lose kelp, you'll lose the seagrass and so on. But you'll also lose the potential to do things with crafting stations that require clean. So crafting recipes will, you'll have a certain degree of water that is required, but it's also going to be requiring clean water. So at the end, you might have polluted your world to the point where you need to add a sewage filter or a waste filter to kind of filter the incoming water to be able to to have it useful. I think more emphasis should be placed into fishing as not just an early game food source, but as a society building food. Well, fishing was essentially for pretty much any coastal society, so there would players to act fisher, perhaps cooking recipes. Yeah, so that is definitely something that we'll be looking into as well in the future. Fishing has always been kind of tricky in terms of fishing rod. There's been, back and forth. Do we want to add some sort of, mini game type of thing that a lot of other games have been adding recently to turn it into an activity rather than just point, click, pull up fish and rinse, repeat 27,000 times. And fisher boats. Fisher boats exist. We have a fishing trawler. I don't think we have any fishing trawlers out because they've been a bit misbehaving in terms of placement restrictions. But yeah, can't place mine. I have one right now. That should be. I can look over and confirm it on Discord, but I believe it's merged. That should be. It should be doable very quickly. Gabriel posted a fix today for it. Layered farms make me never want to play a farmer because I'm opposed to competing with someone that plays all day 5-layered farm. I believe something like this is what you're referring to when it comes to the multi-layering of farms. And yeah, like I said, this is something that we'll be looking into to kind of mitigate and not necessarily combat, but add more restrictiveness to it. So having these types of functionalities will also come with a certain amount of cost and infrastructure involvement than just building a box and some dirt. We're also looking at future-wise improving fertilizing and how nutrients are working and so on. So this might be difficult in terms of being able to constantly supply your farm with nutrients, because at the moment nutrients are really, really difficult to deplete just on the premise of how they're calculated. And because they're working in a chunk-based radius, it's also really easy to support and combat that. So that'll be another stream, another topic, another day, but we're definitely keeping track on it and keeping that in mind as we're fertilizing. Who knows? Maybe. We'll see. I think it would be a really fun one to work on, focusing on the ecological impact and implication of everything. But we do have a couple of really big topics to look over. I like this bridge building people are. They look nice. They look fitting. Happy to see some nice visual, creative, aesthetically sound structures. Those stacked farms might be in for some trouble from oil setup. Yeah, the oil pumping right next to the farms is an interesting extra flavor. A big reason people make stacked farms is because of the fertilizer bug. I wouldn't say a bug, more as to fertilizers they're working exactly as they're intended to be used. They're just not super optimal in terms of how the calculation works as a result of how players are using farms. So there's a couple of an issue in between what the math is doing compared to what players are doing. Yes. But yeah, it's the whole farming thing and the fertilizing thing is something that is constantly in the back of my head, and it's definitely something that we want to be looking at going post the settlements update. Add canning in that update. We do have some assets canning. If they were ever shown somewhere, but we've got some like this while it's still, you know, multi-layered farms, there's, you know, more sound structural thing going on here. And I don't feel as bad when it comes to like gardens almost like this comparatively. You know, this is some really clever use of spatial elements. Had some interesting creative designs here. Harbor Master building here with some creative attachments. Speaking of, we've got our transport boats. So people on Sea Otter, what are your opinions on the changed storage for the transport now? That one should be in since a while back. Bumped up the carry capacity of the transport boat quite significantly, which it'll probably be adjusted later on once we look at it. Yeah, the slots are up to large lumber stockpiles almost, but I wasn't really sure how I wanted to deal with slot count versus stack limits. So it's in a bit of an experimental phase. I might end up changing out some of the stack sizes instead to slot count. Make them more usable for things that are heavier, but not necessarily as much. So feel free to leave some messages on in one of the threads for the playtest. Thoughts and comments on what you think of the new spatial allocations. That one. Yeah. A bit of didn't hear me stream, but we would have loved to have the roughly double capacity on one Tiger. Yeah, well, the whichever is going to be staying on capacity wise for the boat for during the playtest here is going to be going out onto White Tiger initially, and then we'll see if we tweak the storage to Tiger or what kind of results we're looking at. This is some really... People are really conforming to raw food lack in the world by adding farms basically everywhere around their properties. Building invaded someone. We'll look at the map and see at in terms of towns and settlement. And as we can see, there's quite a few towns. There's a couple of bigger ones that are not really happy to see, even though we've had a lot of complications for the towns that the players on Sea Otter has been experiencing, and apologize for all the madness that has been going on. We are working on it, and there's a lot of fixes that are being pending, and everyone is kind of churning out and getting some of those as quickly as we can, as stable as we can. Got a small little country here, and we've got one that has bloated like crazy. Got some pretty crazy culture. I think most of the culture is coming from properties themselves, and it's... I think it's terrible that I can get stuck on an island without food. that is an unfortunate side effect. Now, for general restrictiveness of things in general, for server owners, this can be tweakable. There's a crazy amount of tweakable things that goes on in terms of the server management. Here we go. A lot of common questions that keeps popping up on Discord in terms of how restrictive these things are gonna be, and kind of what is roaming around. You have all of the swimming restrictions and all of the kind of requirements, and I've shown this off in a previous stream, but just as a kind of quick rundown. You can change out the speed modifiers in the different biomes for swimming, and so this is a straight multiplying. It's a multiplier applied to sprint / swim speed. So, ocean swim speed, deep ocean swim speed, and that'll nuke down and reduce it or increase it depending on what you want for your server. And then you've got the calorie consumption rate, which is multiplying the default calorie consumption, the passive rate for just being in the world or roaming around, by a factor of 2 or 30, depending on if it's in ocean or deep ocean. And this can be tweaked out and changed out to whatever you want. And then you've got allow deep ocean building or false, which is false. You're not allowed to build inside the deep ocean biome, which will hard prevent you from building above the ocean level. You can build tunnels, but you can't build stuff above the water or above like the seabed, if you will. And then for the concern of swimming restrictions, you can turn off the restriction of drowning when swimming. So if you flip this over to false, then you're not going to get teleported. You can still swim. You're just going to be swimming really, really slowly while you're out of calories. So this is something that is toggle able from a server perspective. So this is generally what the default settings are looking at, and like I said, any server can customize these to their crazy scenarios or whatever they want to be doing in terms of restrictiveness, or if they want to have some of the more previous behaviors and so on and so forth. Being able to use bathrooms to push cultural building, great choice. Anthropologically speaking, yeah. I think the original design idea when we were looking at culture was the premise of, like, if you have a museum, for instance, or if you have like a showroom or something that has cultural objects, regardless of what type they are. Generally speaking, a public plot would always have like a public bathroom of some sort. So that's kind of why bathrooms are counted into cultural property value. But it is also meaning that we're looking at cultural objects and kind of cultural value. Ooh, sorry, been a long day. Kind of how much culture you're getting from these cultural objects compared to the bathroom objects, and where they're complementing each other, and how much cultural properties you can place down by default, and so on and so forth. So there's still a lot of balance tweaking to come in and revolve around it. I'm also looking at scaling down, kind of tweaking out and changing out the calculation for the influence border to make sure that they are also kind of scaling with world size. Right now they're very static and very set in terms of you know, how big a culture can, how big a country can get, or how big a town can get, versus like if you change the world size to be twice as large, then at the moment the towns are not going to be able to get any bigger because it's a static value towards the town itself, and it doesn't have a dynamically scaling value for the world size. So that's something that I'm looking at. Yeah, I think that's it for this stream. Went over the water stuff. I think everyone's going to be really happy when that one is deployed. It's still pending. I wish there were custom settings for how you handle a death penalty if you drown or run out of food. Server would like optional loot loss instead of auto recovery. I mean, so you'd basically, you know, drop your bag, so on. Yeah, I think that is definitely something that is moddable. It'll probably not be something that's coming out of in terms of vanilla, but you could definitely add a mod for a script that just fires off when it runs the death script, basically, or the drown script. It scans through your inventory, copies the inventory into a bag that's dropped on the ground where you're supposed to be teleported to, and then you get teleported to like a spawn point or something. Definitely doable from the mod side. Probably not going to be something that we're looking to add from a standpoint, though. You know, hit up your local friendly modder to see if they can't look at it. Yeah, quite happy with this. You guys got enough work to do. Yeah, we definitely have our plate cut out for us. Plenty of things to do, plenty of things to polish and fix up for 10. Also a lot of plans for the future, so looking forward to keep hammering at it. And as noticed, we've moved the streams to be more of a bi-weekly occurrence, just give a little bit more of a spacing in between streams to make them manageable from my perspective, but also I give a little bit more of backbone to what the streams are containing and what I can go over in for that work. On track for targets. I really like the auto pickup bug. I was actually responsible for that one. Unintended, but I can take credit for being responsible for that one. I was tweaking out the interaction speed in between pickups, and on my end in the editor, everything was working nicely. It was not. It was starting the animation, it was stopping the animation in between the events, but somehow on a built client, it never stopped the interaction, so it kept just looping through it as soon as it ended the first one. Turned it into an auto pickup feature, which was definitely not something I had planned for. So we had our great animator and